Ow, that hurts, you know. Troy hissed, slinching his body away from the girl as best as he could. Teeth snapping like an animal. His avoidance only made her hold on tighter to the stump that was once his arm. Her eyes narrowed to try to get him to stop wriggling. Quit moving, or it's going to hurt worse, she chided, it spraying the open wound again, and with what's left of the antiseptic. Troy hissed in pain, his eyes screwing shut. He continued to scowl, almost pouting like a child would, before he finally settled himself long enough for her to wrap up the scabbing injury. Clementine rolled her eyes and just adjusting the gauze onto the wound, sealing it with a few tight knots. She could feel the man relax underneath her, his muscles deflating as the adrenaline to go gets away seemed to only fade away once more with the constant pain that had died down. It had once been 3.5 days since they decided to rest at the gift shop, and for the most part things had been all right. They lived sparingly off the small amount of food they had at the pharmacy, and all of them had made it through the cold nights, even Troy, Rebecca, and AJ. The 3 weakest members of their party were recovering slowly at the very least. AJ was still cared for. Troy seemed to be back to his unpleasant self. Without hesitation, Clementine placed a hand on the man's forehead, gouging the lack of intense heat. That was a good sign. Your fever's gone, she commented with a smile, or at the very least, it's not dangerous anymore. Good, about fucking time, he sighed, swatting her at her hand to get her away. Once she was finished changing his bandages, she sat back up on her knees and gave him a quick glance over. Really, she knew exactly why she was the one taking care of the amputee, but it didn't really make any suck any less. Troy complained and whined a lot, but at least he wasn't half dead anymore. It was bittersweet. She supposed he was feeling better, but once he was more opening up his mouth. Do you really think you'll be alright to travel? She asked. If he said no, she wasn't exactly sure what he'd do. He'd have to move. Thankfully, though, he merely nodded, leaning back against the wall. Looking around, Clementine checked to see if the rest of the group looked like as if they were fit to leave. Nick and Luke were preparing whatever items they could find in the backpacks left over from the drugstore, arguing about who should carry what. Kenny and Sarita were making sure Rebecca could stand and hold on to her baby safely, while Sarah hoovered nearby for support. Bonnie and Mike were both stretching as though they just woken, and Jane was off to the side, brooding as usual. After Rebecca was standing steadily, Sarah hurried over to Clementine and Troy. How are you feeling? She asked one of the armed men, who simply gave her a nonchalant shrug in response. Since the little chat between Sarah and Troy that Clementine had overheard, the two of them had got along a lot better, or at least he wasn't as hostile towards the girl, and didn't seem to be more than ready to hit her every time. He looked at her almost as if Troy was a dog, like he had said, a wounded animal being taken care of by a kind soul, feeling loyalty to that person as a result. He was growing used to Sarah being around him, and at the very least in return, Sarah didn't seem as frightened as him, and almost didn't hesitate before asking, "Is it okay if I check on your forehead for a fever?" Clementine just did that, Troy pointed out. Flashing a glance over at her friend, Sarah shrugged. "I just want to be sure." Troy opened his mouth to argue, presumably, but thought better of it and just shrugged again. "Whatever, I don't care. You're going to do what you like anyway, aren't you?" The girl smiled, leaning forward and pressing her palm to his forehead. He grimaced, wanting every much out of his situation, but didn't move until she retreated backwards. "Cool as a cucumber," Sarah reported, beaming. Troy just rolled his eyes and said nothing. The silence that befell with the three of them was awkward, Sarah fidgeting quietly and giving a helpless look to Clementine. Clementine gave her an amused look, mouthing out the 2 words to clue Sarah what she was thinking about. "Ice cream." Sarah giggled, returning to the man. Troy, what's your favorite ice cream flavor?" she asked, her grin stretching wider. Troy blinked, almost as if though he was unsure if he heard her properly. "Does it frickin' matter?" he finally growled. "World's turned to shit anyway. Ain't going to find any ice cream around." Frowning, the girl replied, "Well, I guess you're right. But if the world wasn't all bad, or I'm thinking before, What was your favorite? Why do you care about stupid things like that? Troy snapped, his eyes narrowing into a glare. Seriously, this shit has nothing to do with anything, so just keep your trap shut. Sarah flinched, gazing down at her hands apprehensively. I think it's a good thing to remember things before, just in case if you're ever sad, you could just think about your favorite ice cream flavor. Or what did you like to do on the weekends? It doesn't matter, the man repeated a bit quieter. Look, I don't like you thinking about that kind of shit. You forget about being sad completely. She'd only the way to survive this shit world. Clementine narrowed her own gaze. Maybe people don't want to move on. Maybe we lost people that we care about that want to forget about how much we miss them. Then you're just being frickin' dumb, Troy snarled. You brats ain't the only people who lost someone, and y'all don't get a cookie for clinging on to the past. His heart wasn't the malicious one tone, but he usually tackled on to the end of his words, and he ended up shaking his head to clear it. Look, let's just forget about this, alright? Sarah's gaze fell, but then she nodded in return. I was just trying to help, sorry. Have you held any more ghost pains? Troy rubbed the back of his neck uncomfortably. Yeah, they're still there, been going in and out for the past few days. I think that's normal, the girl replied, biting her lip, and we can't do anything about them. I know, he replied, with yet another shrug. Clementine supposed the one less limb was prone to using his shoulders to express himself more often now. Either that, or he really just was passive or clueless about everything, Sarah was asking. Hey Clem, can you come here? Luke called out from across the gift shop, waving over to her. Thankful of distraction and knowing that Troy was in good hands with Sarah, she hurried over to the man. Nick was standing next to him. The two girls were giving attention. She glanced up at them expectantly. What is it? Are we all ready to go? She asked. Luke bent down to her level, meeting her eyes. This was one of the favorite things about Luke. He treated her with respect and met her gaze, rather than always looking down on her. She smiled, and he gave him a firm nod. Yeah, we should be just about ready. How's Troy doing? Clementine shrugged. Fine, I guess. His fever's gone. According to Sarah, he seems to be stable. She knew that new scratch about medical treatment apart from the basics, so she was useless. If he wanted any details, it didn't seem like he was curious enough, though, judging by the way he had once nodded. I don't know how she can handle him, to be honest, he murmured, looking over at the two of them. Clementine followed his gaze, nodding the way Sarah looked a bit something uncomfortable. Then before speaking to Troy, he had a look on his face that he wasn't too interested in whatever she was saying, but he also didn't look hostile either. Things between them were odd, but so as long as he wasn't hurting her, Clementine didn't care. At least he wasn't threatening to hit her every few seconds, nor bragging her about how hard he wanted to do it. Maybe she sees him as an injured animal. She suggested with a shrug, kind of like a bird with a broken wing. Nick nodded thoughtfully. I guess that makes sense. Sarah's the type to pick up something like that if she saw it was hurt. I think even as an asshole bird. Like a rooster, Luke chimed in, giving a chuckle. Brightening, the girl smiled. He'll be good to go soon, but we need to give him some time and something better to wear than a t-shirt. And a weapon would be good too. She then didn't like the idea of keeping watch on him. Troy knew his way around with a gun, but that was much certain. And if he could just use it to protect himself, it wouldn't be a problem. Nick looked apprehensive. I'm just a little hesitant. What if he shoots one of us? We could easily overpower him, and he knows it, Clementine pointed out. I don't think he'll try anything. She was honestly surprised by her own words. Since when did she have so much faith in Troy? Who was to say he wouldn't shoot someone the moment that they gave him a spare pistol? Somehow it just didn't feel possible right now. Not with how much she went through just to keep the asshole alive. He wouldn't hurt his saviors, would he? Nerves gone on her insides. What was the right option? We have to, she pursued. shaking her head in dismissal. Without a weapon and with only one arm, we'd be sending Troy to death. Luke pursed his lips together and thought. Clem's got a point. He can't really defend himself in the condition without something. Nick blinked. Fine, just be careful. Clementine then had to smile, since when he was Nick of all people, concerned about being careful, the man who nearly shot Clementine herself the moment they met, for no reason other than the itchy trigger finger, it was a sign that he was changing. At least he seemed more cautious nowadays, which wasn't a bad thing. Okay, do we have any guns to spare? She asked, looking around at the group. It looked like Kenny, Mike, Bonnie, Jane, Luke, and Nick had guns at their sides, but were there any extras? Fortunately, Luke nodded. We took what we could from Howe's, and I think here's an extra revolver. Hey, Mike, he called over, turning his head to look at the man with the scarred eye and ear. Mike was standing against the wall, waiting for the group to be ready to move on. He approached him once Luke had waved over to him. What's up? Clementine requested a four-hand revolver, crossing her arms with his eyebrows raised in almost surprise. Mike stammered, rubbing the back of his neck. What's a kid gonna do with two guns? I'm not just a kid, Clementine snapped, narrowing her eyes, and it's for Troy. Understanding wormed its way into the man's features, but scowled as it settled on his lips at the same time. Yeah, not so sure Troy deserves anything I'd give him, but I guess you do have a point and all. Guy's gonna be a lurker chow if we don't give him something. I can hear you know, Troy hissed, from ways off, flinching as he attempted to get into a kneeling position. Clementine raised a brow as she watched him struggle to do it, waving Sarah off as she attempted to help, and getting his trembling knees onto the ground. Once he made it that far, he went further, standing up shakily before using the wall behind him as slight support. He did seem to be doing better, though, and the rest had been all worth for that. Mike snorted and called back. So, you're going to dispute? You won't get a gun if you put up a good argument. Troy's jaw clenched tightly in frustration, but he ultimately said nothing. Seems like he's got a point, Luke commented with a shrug. Anyway, Clementine continued sternly, reaching out for her hand. The gun? Yeah, Mike sighed. Clearly reluctant, but he reached inside the bag, unhooked a small revolver, and handed it over to the child. It's got enough bullets to last a little while. I hope he knows we can't waste them, though. Clementine shrugged as she gazed over at the silver weapon. Hopefully, she didn't doubt that the value of a weapon, knowing that he had always had one to tote around back at Howe's. With a nod to the three, she made her way back to Sarah and Troy, pausing before handing the gun over to Troy. I'm going to give you this, but only if you promise to only use it for killing walkers only. She began carefully, casting an icy stare at his way. Please don't make me regret this, Troy. The man sighed, shaking his head and pushing himself forward off to the wall, standing as straight as he could, meeting her gaze, his jaw once more clenched tightly, a habit that she'd noticed him doing often more when she was around him. With a firm nod, he replied, I know, I ain't going to believe it or not. I don't get a reason to turn on all ya. If anything, I could sort of see why you want to all turn on me. With a scowl, he added quickly, Don't mean I ain't keeping my eyes on you. With a roll of her eyes, Clementine replied, Same here. But he was right. They had no reason to trust him. At least he was aware of it, though, and that alone made her feel slightly better about her decision to give him a weapon. If nothing else she could say, Troy knew his place. Not a bad gun, though, he replied thoughtfully, inspecting the revolver. Colt Python .357 Magnum. Fires nice, handles well. Bill had one of these. Piercing her lips, Clementine snapped, We probably got it from him then. She probably didn't know the origin of the gun, but Troy's admiration for the gun and the former leader was enough to make her question why he was ultimately going to do with the firearm. After Kenny killed him, Troy's brow furrowed, with an annoyed look crossing his features, but merely placed the gun on his belt. Sarah perked up suddenly, clearly obvious to anything related to weapons. Oh, I almost forgot. I'll be right back. Sarah then turned around, darting deeper into the gift shop, rummaging through something behind the checkout counter. Troy and Clementine exchanged glances as she seemed determined to find whatever they could to help, but be curious. After a few moments, the girl returned to a dark and black hoodie in her hands. This looked like about your size. I'm glad I found it. Hanging it over to Troy, she smiled as he reached out to grab it, a sheepish look crossing her face. Troy got a good look at the jacket, his eyes growing wider as he noticed the bright white block letters spelling out Parker's Run. Splotches of neon colors dotted all over the jacket and decoration. Clementine then stifled a chuckle. She had seen the souvenirs before, and they reminded her of those sold boardwalk shops at the beach. Apparently the Civil War gift shop also liked to sell them, making her believe that they were popular with tourists, that she never wear one though herself. Reminded of how he mocked the bright blue jacket, Clementine absent-mindedly commented, I'm not saying you're a dumbass for wearing that color, but you're a dumbass. A smirk crossed her lips as the sour look he flashed at a response. It can't, can it? He snarled, heaving a heavy sigh. At least it looks warm. I think it looks cool, Sarah exclaimed. I wish I would have found one in my size. Scoffing, Troy then slipped the jacket on over his t-shirt as best he could, wincing as the fabric pressed against his wound. His eyes trailed over to the sleeve, hanging limply at his side, a disappointed look on his face. His feelings were quite clear, a sadness crossing his features rather quickly at the thoughts of wearing the jacket without a limb to place it on a sleeve. Without a word, Clementine then reached forward and rolled up the sleeve, nodding and bunching just to see where his wound would begin. Her eyes then met with his and merely nodded to thanks in silence. So now that you're equipped, Clementine finally said, after a few more moments of quiet, we can get going. Troy nodded. Yeah, fine. This is gonna suck. Don't even start, she hissed back at him with a half-hearted glare. You're lucky to be alive. To her surprise, he nodded, acknowledging that he couldn't have gotten up at this point without her. With a quick glance at his empty sleeve, he simply muttered, I know. The group trudged on slowly, making their way through the snow like molasses. Clementine hugged herself, the bright blue jacket almost binding in the white snow as she forced her frozen legs to move. She clearly could see her breath puffing in and out air in front of her, her teeth chattering being one of the only sounds as they kept moving along. Winter was silent, a beautifully cruel season. Instead of snowman and snow angels, 11-year-old had to focus on staying alive by securing the warmth and food. Gone were the days of simple snowball fights where a mug of hot cocoa and a heated blanket would fix any degree of shivers. Not that she ever did those things herself, being from the warmer southern state, but still, based on Christmas specials she watched on television, those seemed like fun activities to do in the snow. She let out an extra long sigh, the breath practically freezing instantly in the cold air. Hugging herself tighter, Clementine glanced at the rest of the group with familiar senses. Fuck, it's cold. Troy shivered next to her, doing his best to cover himself up with the remaining arm. Sarah was on her other side, nodding in agreement with her head lowered. Behind them, Rebecca was staggering with Sarita and Bonnie, looking weaker and weaker each step she took. Luke, Mike, Nick, and Kenny and Jane were spread out ahead. Nick, who was barely in front of Clementine, gazed back at Rebecca, shooting a glare towards Troy. Stop complaining. It's only going to change how cold we all feel. Troy narrowed his eyes and he clenched his jaw. Listen, asshole, I just got over a fever, I know. I carried your sorry ass up to the observation deck, remember? What? The amputee's eyes widened for a moment, processing with the question. Clearly, he didn't recall such an event. Avoiding Nick's gaze, he snapped in reply. Well, no one frickin' asked you to. Nick was about to respond when Sarita called ahead, a worried tone in her voice. Kenny, we need to slow down. The man shook his head. Can't do that, Sarita. We gotta get somewhere safe before sundown. It's the only chance we got to get closer to Wellington. But Kenny, Sarita chewed on her lip, glancing at Rebecca, who was clinging on tightly with one hand while holding AJ on the other. Her frame was barely supported by Bonnie, who was trying her best to help. The new mother shook her head, her fingers tightening around Sarita's jacket. No, I can keep moving. You don't have to stop. No, Rebecca, you need to rest, Luke chimed in, shaking his head. Kenny, I said we gotta stop. I said we can't, goddammit! Kenny hissed, snapping his head back with a glare. His raised voice woke up AJ, who started to cry at the loud volume. The man's face instantly softened, and he slowed his pace. All right, fine, but not for too long. How about here? Everyone slowed down at the same time, coming across an abandoned campsite. All the equipment was buried in the snow, making it barely usable for even sitting on. Rebecca didn't seem to mind, though. She stopped with the rest of the group, sitting herself down on a snow-covered chair. Sarita crouched near her, her tone growing more anxious. Just focus on AJ, Rebecca. It'll be okay. You'll be okay. Clementine approached the weak woman, glancing over at her frail frame. Her hands were trembling, clutching tightly around the bundled baby in her arms. With her body hunched over and her head drooping, Rebecca looked as if though she was dying. Her eyes lifted to meet Clementine's eyes, and the girl's heart nearly dropped. The fire was gone, no trace of spark in her brown irises. No, she really was dying. Clementine's blood ran cold as she gazed at Sarita, who had the same grief-stricken look, and bent down to Rebecca's level, murmuring, Rebecca? Rebecca, how are you doing? Can you hear me? The woman barely noticed her at first, weakness from birth and physical exhaustion proving too much for her. Finally, her tired eyes did meet with the girl's, the smallest of smiles cracked on her lips. He's so handsome. Her frozen fingers curled around the baby once more. A shuddering breath had leaving her. He is, Clementine replied, her voice crackling. He's very lucky to be taken care of by many good people. Rebecca's head leaned down even more, her arms physically wrapping AJ protectively. I love you, my little man. Please be safe. Clementine's eyes went dull as she watched the woman take her last breaths. Bringing up her gun, the barrel was pointed towards the mother, but showed no fear of dying. Instead, desperate plea was evident, clearly in the brown irises of her eyes. What are you all doing? Sarah cried, suddenly grabbing onto her friend's arm. Why are you going to shoot Rebecca? I have to, Sarah, Clementine muttered in response. Luke placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. She's dying, Sarah, and you know what happens next. Or maybe she didn't. Maybe Carlos sheltered her so much that she didn't know what a bite or no bite would do. Everyone was infected and would turn when they die. That is when Sarah herself would become a walker, if no one was around to put her down. Perhaps Clementine reasoned that there wasn't necessarily a bad thing, so long as Sarah knew how to fight the walkers and know how to put people down when they were bit. The other parts weren't necessary to know. No, that was selfish of her. What if Sarah was just with someone alone, and she went to sleep feeling safe, but the other died in her sleep and attacked her? What if she came across someone she thought it was just sleeping, but in reality they're already dead? All sorts of terrible scenarios flew through Clementine's mind. Now she could see some of Carlos's plight, but Clementine owed it to her friend to be truthful and not to hide anything from her. Even if you're not bit, you still turn into a walker after you die, she whispered, turning her attention back to Rebecca. Before she did, however, it was hard to miss the horrified look on Sarah's face. Rebecca merely focused on AJ, the child blissfully unaware of it in his slumber. Her breath began to slow down, but her eyes didn't seem to close yet. Clementine nearly pulled the trigger there, but a loud shouting stopped her, raising her gaze in the direction of the noise, and heard a faint squeaking sound, along with a figure limping while away from them. Hello? The person cried, raising their arms. What is this? Mike asked. No idea, Bonnie replied, patting the gun to her side. But we can't be too careful. Damn right we can't, Troy snapped, stepping forward and yelling, What the hell do you want? Jane leaned forward and grabbed him by his shoulder. What are you doing, you idiot? Troy then shot a glare and snarled, We don't know them. They could be anyone. So, give them the incentive to shoot us, Nick hissed. Just keep quiet for once in your life, you stupid rooster. What the fuck did you all just call me? The amputee looked as if he ripped Nick's skin off, but the figure just yelled out in a greeting once more. Its staggering form, a tall teenage boy with a leg brace and glasses. Clementine honestly had never seen him before, but he seemed to know them. She glanced around, receiving shrugs and blank stares from the rest of the group. Hello there, Luke called back, lifting an arm in an awkwardly wave. What can we help you with? Greetings, the boy said, creaking into a stop in front of them. His voice had a heavy accent to, what was it, Russian? Clementine couldn't be so sure. Are you those things that stayed at Parker's Run, are you not? Kenny then stepped up and his eyes narrowed. Yeah? What of it? Who's frickin' asking? I'm Arvo, and you're... Clementine stood up. I'm Clementine, she greeted, trying to make the situation at least less awkward. It didn't really help, though, but at least Sarah joined in and introduced herself as well. Oh, I'm so glad to know, Adam. So glad your group is... can we get that in English? Kenny asked, giving a glare from Sarita. Arvo's eyes narrowed when the smile suddenly vanished, a deep frown then soon taking its place. Healthy now, so I'd like to say, you give us your things now. Place things on the ground and no one gets hurt. He held up a gun and his hand trembling. Troy snorted. You are gonna hurt anyone with that revolver? You can't even fucking grip it. I will, and I don't want to shoot. Do not make me shoot. Whoa, Mike said, holding up his hands. Just take it easy, kid. Maybe we can work some trade of some kind. Jane then narrowed her eyes. We're not giving you the likes of you. You're awfully brave to rob us alone. Rob you? Arvo cried. His gaze darted into the forest. Before Clementine could even blink, a few other strangers came out into the open. Two standing around behind Arvo with guns in their hands. Others appear in the forest, weapons pointing towards the group. Who are those people? Bonnie cried. And what the frick is going on? Troy squawked. The rest of the Russians, at least, they assumed as they were all such, cackled in their dark laughs, echoing throughout the quiet landscape. Arvo's eyes glittered with resentment, still holding his gun up. Well, why are they laughing? Clementine asked, trying to get in front of Sarah as best she could. The girl was clinging onto the material of the jacket, panicked breaths escaping her rapidly. They think it's funny? That you're just a little girl? Did you steal the supplies that you find? Arvo asked, his voice cold. Kenny looked down at her bewildered. You stole from these guys, Clem? Clementine shook her head. What? No. What could they be talking about? Her eyes then darted around, looking at each member of the group as they had the answer. And suddenly it dawned on the moment and she looked at Jane. The supplies they found, the medicine that saved Troy's life, had belonged to this group, and despite her not originally wanting to, she had stolen them. She had taken from these people, just as the motoring group people took from the stranger's car. Still, she tried to plead to her case. It had to be different. That stuff, it had been tossed into the garbage can, and we needed it. Arvo snapped back. You are not special. You do not get to take those things without a consequence. One of them called out and people were talking in Russian, but no one could understand them. The girl next to Arvo, who seemed pale, hesitated to bring the gun out. Everyone in the group yelling in Russian were overwhelming. Clementine felt the attention crawl through the air like spiders through a web. She then picked up the hem of her coat, biting her lip. We don't even know that they were your supplies, Sarita explained, her hands raised in defense. Please, we have to get the baby and his mother out of the cold. You have a baby with you? Arvo practically gasped, his eyes whitening behind the glasses, turning to his cohorts and said something. I'm scared, Clem, Sarah cried. What are they saying? Why are they pointing guns at us? Look, we don't want any trouble, Mike yelled, retracting his gun nevertheless. Troy then reached for his gun, and as did Luke, Nick, Bonnie, and Kenny. Sarah then crowded behind Sarita, who was doing her best to protect the girl. Clementine retracted her weapon as well, just in case, not before easing in front of Rebecca. She had gotten the best look of dying woman till now. She became paler, a horrible purple color to her skin. Her eyes now closed, reopened with almost feral glow to them. Why did all this happen? Was it already because of the cold, or was it because of the result of being given the painkillers in time? Because Clementine had chosen the life of the man who didn't deserve it over a laboring mother? Fucking back up now if you want out of this. Everyone, put your guns down, please. I can't breathe, Sarita, I can't. Her eyes satin was eaten by panic when she noticed the reanimated woman begin to growl and swing her arms, not yet noticing the little snack sitting on her lap. AJ was in trouble. Clementine did not hesitate. She then pointed the gun at Rebecca and pulled the trigger. Unfortunately, though, it was a signal to the others to start shooting, and the whole world disappear in a blur of gunshots and screams.